Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the Director of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on energy, environment, and opportunities for Mexico's natural gas sector. Before we formally begin, let's take care of logistics. This discussion will last approximately 60 minutes. Following the panelists' remarks and a moderated discussion, we will field questions from the audience. Please submit your questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions link on the event webpage, or use the Ask Questions function in Zoom. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. North America is on the cusp of an unprecedented economic opportunity in the form of nearshoring. The realignment of supply chains from global to regional, combined with pre-existing economic integration under the USMCA, promises to create new opportunities across the board in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. However, often underappreciated is the centrality of energy policy to making nearshoring a possibility. Companies will not move their operations if they cannot be assured of affordable and reliable access to energy. As more and more firms adopt environmental, social, and corporate governance principles, they are also demanding greener energy sources. Here, Mexico regrettably appears to be on the back foot. President López Obrador's energy policy has prioritized oil over renewables and positioned heavily indebted state-owned firm Pemex at the vanguard of the country's energy sector, a responsibility it has proven unprepared to shoulder. Fortunately, there is a solution in the form of Mexico's prodigious reserves of natural gas, which were estimated in 2019 to be well over 6 trillion cubic feet. Natural gas can play a bridging role in Mexico's energy transition, often a cleaner power source than oil, and driving a number of industrial applications that would prove a boon to nearshoring. Indeed, gas is already the predominant fuel source in Mexico's energy mix, with demand having risen steadily over the past decade. Nevertheless, Mexico faces serious obstacles to becoming a natural gas powerhouse. Most notable among these is the country's continued dependency on U.S. gas exports, which for the time being have been cheap and plentiful enough to meet increased demand. But over-reliance on U.S. gas exposes Mexico to supply shocks, while systematically disadvantaging Mexico's southern regions that often lack sufficient infrastructure to meet growing energy demand or capitalize on numerous nearshoring opportunities. A more robust Mexican natural gas sector therefore holds the potential to energize nearshoring throughout the country, in turn paying dividends for the United States and Canada, as well in the form of more resilient and efficient supply chains. But current obstacles should not be understated, and it will take sustained, private sector-led engagement to develop this industry in time to take full advantage of the present nearshoring moment. For this reason, I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce our superlative panel of experts to analyze challenges and opportunities for the future of Mexican and North American natural gas. I have asked each one of them to provide some framing remarks to open our conversation before we move into a moderated discussion. Our first speaker this afternoon is Jennifer Pierce. She's the president of TC Energía. Ms. Pierce has an extensive background in the energy industry, including power generation, gas, and energy transportation. Born and raised in Canada, she has also worked internationally with energy companies in Canada, the US, as well as Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and now Mexico. Our next speaker is Jeremy M. Martin. He's the Vice President of Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. In this role, he has testified before the U.S. Congress on energy issues in Latin America, teaches a graduate course in Latin American energy policy at UCSD and the University of San Diego, and serves on the Board of Advisors for the Inter-American Dialogue's Energy Advisor newsletter. And our final speaker is Christopher Lenton. He's the senior editor for Mexico and Latin America at Natural Gas Intelligence. He's covered Latin American energy markets since 2009 as a reporter, editor, and analyst. And prior to joining NGI, he was a senior editorial manager at BN Americas in Santiago, Chile. So without further ado, over to you, Jennifer, for your opening remarks.
Well, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Good afternoon, everybody. Ryan, Chris, and Jeremy, it's a pleasure to participate on this panel with you. And I think it is a very timely panel, and I think it's great that CSIS has decided to focus on energy transition and the role natural gas can play in Latin America and Mexico, particularly to advance not just the transition, but to advance the economy and the social well-being of this very important region of North America. We have seen the benefits of transitioning to more natural gas and what that has done in the United States as well as in Canada as we moved off higher carbon type energy sources for electricity. And we actually see that happening dramatically in Mexico today. TC Energy has been in Mexico for over 30 years. We have over 4,000 kilometers of natural gas pipelines. In North America, we move 25% of all the molecules of natural gas. So we have a view on this, and I think that we're participating in a very fundamental way across the continent. In Mexico, of course, we have seen a predominance of U.S. exports supporting the advancement of energy transition. I think we would welcome more domestic supply from Pemex or from partners of Pemex. What we've started to see in Mexico early days is some strategic partnerships, very much what the CFE has been advancing. And I think we talk about Pemex as being a key participant in the advancement of more natural gas development in Mexico. But the CFE has been a tremendous catalyst. And I think that we look at a transition of sorts of, we talk about President López Obrador perhaps not promoting gas development at Pemex, but I'm not sure he could do much more than is being done to promote natural gas development in Mexico through the CFE as a key anchor tenant. CFE is using natural gas as a key input into their generation fleet, which I think is directly linked to being able to provide customers in Mexico today and future customers through nearshoring with the reliability, the affordability, and the sustainability they need for their fuel sources. You cannot have an electrical grid as you need to support nearshoring, which is N-1 reliability, without a natural gas baseload. And I would suggest for everybody, as Mexico builds out this natural gas baseload generation, they have not only cut GHG emissions by 50%, they have reduced the NOx, the SOx, and the particulate matter at the same time, which is energy consumers are looking for. That's a very sustainable proposition. In addition to that, we see that Mexico is advancing in other things to support grid stability. And as the country has greater grid stability, I think you will see greater penetration of renewable energy sources. But at this time in the country, every megawatt of renewable energy you need needs to be backed up by at least a megawatt of combined cycle generation or other baseload generation. So as we look forward in Mexico, I think you're going to see more natural gas. I think you may see some incremental partnerships with CFE, such as we've seen with New Fortress Energy, with what we're seeing with Fermaca, Essencia, Sempra Energy. And I think we're starting to see Pemex developing some of these strategic partnerships as well. New Fortress Energy is partnering with Pemex today to develop natural gas assets. Woodside has a very large opportunity that they're looking to develop with Pemex. So I see, quite frankly, that there are some great investment opportunities where corporations such as mine and others are willing to rotate capital into Mexico to partner with the CFE and potentially maybe Pemex in the future to advance domestic resources and promote further North American integration of not just our natural gas, but our electrical grids and our LNG pathways to serve the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Over to you, Jeremy, for your opening remarks.
Unmute. That's a good starting point. Thanks so much. And Jennifer, pleasure. Glad to be joined on the panel by Jennifer and Christopher, two great voices from the media, and of course, a true implementer of infrastructure in Mexico and North America more broadly. Let me just try to marry, and for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to see this wonderful framing notional question document that Ryan and his team put together, and thank you all for the invitation, by the way. But for those who didn't get to see this wonderful framing document, there are an enormous amount of topics that really run a gamut. And what I want to do is try to marry as many of those together as possible with sort of a tale of Back to the Future and going a little bit back in time. And really what I want to say is a tale of policy uncertainty and unclear goals and objectives for natural gas in Mexico that ultimately led to an import dependency choice. So many of you joining us know that over 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, Mexico underwent a massive reform of its state-led energy sector. As part of the overhaul, interestingly though, and what I want to focus on was there were voices at the time calling for a gasification strategy that Mexico needed as part of the overhaul and as part of the reform, a gasification strategy that would indeed address the growing gap and domestic deficit of natural gas, exactly for reasons that Jennifer spoke to about the evolution of the power sector from a less clean sourced power generation to natural gas and eventually even more with renewables. There was a leading voice in that the gasification of Mexico conversation and goal, or at least discussion of putting it on the table. Somebody named Edgar Rangel, and I want to quote Edgar, and may he rest in peace. He's a wonderful, was a wonderful friend, CNH commissioner. But at the time, and why he said that Mexico should indeed consider a gasification strategy, is that increasing domestic gas availability would facilitate the industrialization of Mexico. So I think, he was quite prescient, and I think it underscores a lot of the conversations that we're having today and in general right now about exactly how can Mexico continue to avail itself of this nearshoring opportunity, and where does energy fit, and just exactly what needs to happen with energy. And again, the unrealized goal back then of gasification was seen as perhaps a way to harness what now we call the nearshoring opportunity, but what they described as an industrialization opportunity of the country. And moreover, Pemex's evolution into the gas world, and whether it be via a gasification strategy or the provider of sourced gas for CFE and power generation in the country, as well as industrial use, was something that was, part of this idea. Unfortunately, it didn't occur. And the reality is, yes, we can focus on the woes at Pemex, and the NOC is clearly to a degree culpable. But I would suggest to you actually what happened is more of a positive element that drove the de facto import dependency. And that was the fact of the booming shale revolution and just the amount of capacity that the U.S. had, the wonderful opportunity that Mexico had to bring imports of cheaper U.S. gas, available gas, that only needed infrastructure that companies like Jennifer's and Sempra and many others jumped in to help build and really consolidate that opportunity. So it was certainly the effort of Pemex was obviated to a certain degree by its woes, but I would suggest not just by Pemex's woes, but really by the sort of changing context of the shale revolution and the opportunity of imports from the U.S. and really also provide the U.S. an important a valve of exports to Mexico. But I think now, as we look at the current situation, we need to realize that to power this spike in industrial capacity, but also to align more with industrial development and the investors' ESG and net zero commitments that are really the ones who are, lining up to put into the plants and parks and the maquilas their investment. This de facto natural gas policy is now needed to be reevaluated, but more importantly, the more concerning aspect of the overall management of the power sector and what I could say is an incoherent overall energy policy in Mexico is something that needs to also be addressed more broadly. The other point I want to put on the table, and this again marries some of the elements that you brought forth, Ryan, and your team on this backgrounder, is the North-South Divide, right? And really this boom in the North, while at the same time in the South, and of course I'm referring to Mexico, has not been seen. And I would say that part of this opportunity foregone with gasification in Mexico, and particularly the role of Pemex, is both an opportunity to supply Central America with some gas, and as that route and as that pipeline infrastructure would have been developed by Mexico to reach Central America, Guatemala specifically, you would have also seen the opportunity to really leverage a more secure and available and consistent source of energy and deliver energy security to those southern states along that pipeline. So I would suggest to you this idea of gasification that surely was obviated by the reality of the shale revolution, but also had a major contribution to what occurred in terms of, I would say, the stark polarization between North and South, or did not, I would say, help to alleviate any of those economic discrepancies that now we see so clearly. And if we fast forward to today, there is a newfound effort of this government in Mexico to indeed really try to bring economic development to the southern area, and the Trans-Isthmus Corridor, which puts on the table a huge industrialization corridor, a slew of industrial parks, railroad, but also a gas pipeline. And so again, if we look at the shadows that are cast because of what's not happened with Mexico's efforts to gasify or gasification by way of Pemex to solve that domestic deficit, we need to better understand, well, what's going to be the difference this time with the Trans-Isthmus Corridor when it comes to being able to deliver, in this case, gas or certainly more reliable and assured energy sources there. Just to finalize, I do think, though, if we step back and if we look at the broader opportunity in North America, there certainly is, and Jennifer spoke to some projects that are being done, some important partnerships. There are projects of recent announcements here in Baja California, in Sonora, that speak to major developments that are integrating and deepening the integration of natural gas and really providing opportunities for developers and those who seek to export to whether it's Asian markets or solve part of the energy security crisis of the globe driven by the Russian invasion and therefore land more gas and LNG in Europe. Mexico and North America and U.S. gas and Mexico infrastructure really is a positive story that's developing. So I want to, while I emphasize some of the foregone opportunities and some of the challenges that I think there's foregone opportunities to speak to, I do want to emphasize that there really continues to be this important opportunity. And the final point I'd make on that is, as part of the polarization more broadly, the politicization of energy is clear, right? I don't need to tell anyone here about what's happened with the energy policy debates in Mexico, but elsewhere across the world, right? And I think the interesting thing is, for whatever reason, natural gas has not been as subsumed into this politicization in Mexico. As a matter of fact, the project in Sonora, the big announcement was led by the president himself. Some of these deals that have been announced, the partnerships with Pemex, the partnerships with CFE and private companies, have been touted by the president himself, if not senior officials in his government. So I would suggest to you that again gives opportunity and space and area for developers and companies and governments. And I think there's a true opportunity now to use this if we really concert our effort into what this means to also consolidate the nearshoring opportunities and deliver that reliable energy that Jennifer emphasized. So let me stop there. I tried to marry a whole host of elements. I hope it worked. But thanks again, Ryan. I hope I didn't speak too long.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the comprehensive set of opening remarks. Over to you, Christopher, for your opening remarks.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brian, for this invitation. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with Jeremy and Jennifer. You did a great job, I think, setting me up. Just a little bit about NGI. We are a price reporting agency. We've been around since the 1980s. We published the first natural gas price table in North America in 1983, and we entered the Mexico market with the Mexico Gas Price Index in 2017, which is a daily publication that I head up. And our goal is just to further transparency in the Mexico natural gas market. So I really wanted to talk about energy security and how that plays into natural gas and the relationship between the United States and Mexico and natural gas. I think energy security really emerged again as a major theme with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it was principally a gas crisis. I mean, we're looking at nations that were too dependent on one supplier. There were very serious consequences. We saw industry shutting down, inflation that still lingers to this day. I'm based here in Santiago de Chile, and we had something similar happen to us in 2005 when Argentina shut off the gas. And it also had very serious economic consequences, and it was difficult for Chile to keep the lights on. And in many ways, they had sort of developed their energy matrix around this notion that natural gas would be available from Argentina. And if you look at the case of Mexico, the dependence that Mexico has on U.S. gas is actually more than, say, Germany. Germany used to source about 50% of its gas from Russia. Mexico imports about 70% of its gas from the United States. And when you add in the gas that Pemex uses in its own processes, you're looking at about 80 to even as high as 90%. So the dependency is real. But the argument that I would make is that natural gas has actually helped energy security in Mexico, or the integration with the United States in terms of natural gas has actually helped. You're looking at about 24 importation points that Mexico now has. You have bigger natural gas pipelines with more capacity. You have diversification of supply, not only in terms of supply basins, but also in terms of the suppliers themselves. We're seeing less critical alerts than you used to see. You see more states with natural gas in Mexico. So if we define energy security in terms of diversification, I think Mexico is doing a much better job as a result of its relationship with the United States. There are still some issues. CFE has a majority of the capacity on the private pipelines and is very much the dominant sort of actor in the market. And that is something that some participants complain about. But I think there's also, it's a relationship that works on both sides. Jeremy mentioned this as well. U.S. producers, the Mexico market is a natural outlet for natural gas that U.S. producers use, and there really isn't a threat that the U.S. government will do something, similar to what Russia and Argentina did, simply because you have all these numerous private agents that are involved, and not only producers but also midstream companies, particularly in places like the Permian Basin where you have production that is booming and you don't have enough takeaway capacity. I mean, at the Waha hub in the Permian, we've seen negative pricing in the last couple of years, which means that they're actually paying, people to offtake their gas. So again, Mexico is a real sort of a natural outlet for those producers. López Obrador came to power talking about, and Jeremy touched on this, talking about energy sovereignty and energy independence, and yet in natural gas we're seeing deeper integration. When he came to power, the U.S. was exporting about 5 BCF a day on the pipelines to Mexico, and now we're looking at about 7 BCF a day. And then, with nearshoring and with the CFE combined cycle plants and with the LNG projects that are being developed, that figure could easily grow another 2 or 3 BCF a day in the same time frame. So we're looking at deeper integration and not less integration as a result. And I think partly that's to do with the fact that AMLO he's an oil guy, and natural gas is in many ways sort of been forgotten about. And if I could just make one final point, the IEA also mentions that part of energy security is energy pricing. Now, last year, natural gas pricing was highly vulnerable. We saw Henry Hub get as high as $10 per MMBTU. Natural gas was the most volatile commodity in the world. And yet this year, we've seen a complete reversal. Henry Hub has returned to a place where it was for many, many years, very stable, very cheap, under $3 per MMBTU. If you look at the forward strip, Henry Hub is going to, we're seeing it get to $3.50 by next winter, but probably back down to $3 by next summer again. Houston Ship Channel, which is for whatever reason what most Mexico contracts are based off of, we see similar pricing. And Waha, you actually see a gain of about 50 cents. And so, there's a lot more natural gas coming from West Texas because of those pricing advantages. And so Mexico really is in a great position, cheap, affordable energy, and I think the government is really on board with using natural gas. It's the main fuel in the United States. It's the main fuel in Mexico in terms of power generation, and I don't see that changing in the short term. So that's my bit for now.
Thank you very much, Chris, as well for those very comprehensive opening remarks. So there is a lot to unpack here. You all have put a lot on the table, and we could take this in any number of directions. But I want to start with something very basic, and that is something that's near and dear to López Obrador's heart. It's what makes him tick. He thinks a lot about the South. he cares a lot about the South, and he's from a southern state. So just start on the very basic building block element. How does energy access factor into these diverging development stories that all of you have mentioned and touched on in your opening remarks? And what efforts are currently underway to increase energy security in the southern part of the country first? And I'll start with you, Jennifer, and go around in the same order.
Well, perhaps for obvious reasons. So you're absolutely right. The president has prioritized the South. It's very strategic. It's very important to remove the gap between the North and the South. We all know how prodigious North manufacturing is in Mexico. And it's really unfortunate to see the South was left behind. And so the priority of this administration is really about social advancement. And we are fortunate enough to be a partner with the CFE in bringing natural gas to the South. We are constructing with them a 715-kilometer pipeline. Majority of it is offshore. It will connect into the Tuxpan pipeline system, and it will bring low-cost, reliable natural gas to the South. And we know from economic studies that have been done that states with natural gas have a 50% higher GDP than states without natural gas. And we can point to very specific examples at the federal level, at the state and local level, where their governments are advocating very actively to bring industry to those economies, to bring industries to those states. In our project alone, we will employ directly over 4,000 people to construct our pipeline. That's just the start of it. And what these individuals will gain are skills that are easily translatable into manufacturing-based jobs. I think we're going to see some relocation of manufacturing roles into the states of Veracruz, into the state of Tabasco, farther south as these state governments really advocate for economic development. And I think that you'll see everything from automotive to digital economies, to fertilizer, to LNG export, which will be able to relocate and participate in new economic opportunities because they'll have low-cost, reliable electricity, which the CFE is building because it is a massive build-out plan in the South. And then also they'll have direct access to natural gas, which they can use for their manufacturing processes. And so we know that this is just one of the things this administration has been doing to bring economic opportunity. The Transísmico Corridor is another significant economic program of this administration. And I think it's extremely strategic and very democratic to try and do that so that they can start to integrate the North and the South and not have a further rift as populations in the southern part of Mexico don't get to participate in the tremendous economic opportunity the country has to offer at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I did not know that figure on access to natural gas and GDP. So that's a very interesting takeaway. Jeremy, over to you. So the role of natural gas in and energy access in this story, this unequal development story in Mexico, and sort of what the administration is doing to continue energy security in the South.
No, absolutely. And I spoke a little bit of what I called an opportunity foregone by the kind of pipeline infrastructure Jennifer and their company, together with Mexican state power company CFE, are building out, being this opportunity foregone because of a lot of those numbers. And those kinds of numbers, maybe not exactly the same, but were the kinds of numbers that folks talked about several years ago, and why perhaps that pipeline to Guatemala shouldn't have been just the focus of bringing some Mesoamerican integration, but rather exactly the point of what that could have meant for reliable, secure energy supplies for the southern states of Mexico. Okay, so we're playing catch up now, right? And I think that's the point. So can this government, with its little time left, continue to be able to implement and deliver the kinds of projects that CFE with partners or CFE alone can deliver? The Transísmico Corridor is absolutely a cornerstone. I personally would have liked to have seen that if it was truly a cornerstone of economic development for the South. I'd like to have seen that in the first year of the administration. Jennifer's pipeline, the first year of the administration. We don't want to go back to the first couple of years of the administration, I know. However, the point being that there was a lot of time lost. And I think the catch-up element is something we have to recognize now. Can we catch up? the royal we, can Mexico and can they catch up and solve this polarization? Can they solve this economic polarization? I don't know.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Chris, your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, if I could just echo what Jeremy said. I mean, the key part for me is that the planned pipeline from Veracruz over to Oaxaca, we haven't seen much movement on it. We haven't seen a tender. And it does seem pretty late in the Lopez Obrador administration, and that would be fairly key to getting gas to some of those southern states. I will commend the efforts of TC Energy and the extension of the Ducto Marino, NG, doubling capacity on the Mayacan. So there have been serious movements to improve gas capacity in that part of the country, but we haven't really seen much in terms of advancement on the Interoceanic Pipeline.
Thanks very much, Chris. So my next question, I want to get very specific about sectors and about industries. We often talk about the nearshoring opportunity like writ large, like this large thing without necessarily getting into a sector by sector approach. And I want to ask a very specific question about which industries you all think would benefit the most from stronger natural gas in Mexico. I'll start with you, Jennifer, if we can get sector by sector specific to provide listeners with a very concrete idea of what's at stake here.
Yeah, so the number one sector everybody's watching right now is LNG exports. That's a sector that's going to benefit tremendously from pipeline access and the ability to move natural gas from the United States. And I don't know about you, but I'm not worried about United States productivity on natural gas. There's a ton of upside happening, and they continue to develop more of it more economically than anybody else in the world. We also see automotive. We spend a lot of time with state governments. I'm so impressed by the work the state governments do here in Mexico to promote economic development. So it really depends on, for example, if you're in the central region, you're going to see industries related to automotive, to aerospace, to digital economy opportunities, to everything from, medical devices. In the southeast, we're seeing, again, automotive. We're seeing fertilizer. We're seeing LNG exports. We're also seeing people that want to co-locate even renewable development of manufacturing components. So we see the componentization of traditional industries that have come to Mexico. I think we're going to see more componentization of electrical vehicles. I mean, Tesla's gone to Nuevo Leon, but there will be a lot of suppliers to the electric car that will co-locate or locate in other jurisdictions where they do have that reliability, where CFE is developing their power generation assets, where CFE has very strong transmission access. So I think you will see the traditional industries here in Mexico double down. You are going to see industries that have perhaps located outside of North America, i.e. Mexico, bring manufacturing back to Mexico. And I think you will see a number of Asian participants locate industries in Mexico to feed automotive, aerospace, some of the other industries that I've spoken about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jennifer. Jeremy, any sector-specific areas you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, actually, let me start with geography because I'm based here in Southern California and right across the border from Baja California, and there is a real need for the industrial capacity to have additional supplies of gas. There has to be increased capacity delivered here. The growth of whether you call it nearshoring or the industrial capacity that has existed here since early NAFTA days is something that needs more gas. So geography, I think, and obviously the question of Sonora and Baja California being those specific terminals to hit the Asian market for the LNG that Jennifer highlighted. But coming away from the geography to the sectors, automotive, I think, is such a crucial one. Obviously, in certain geographies of the country, the more agricultural focused and the inputs for agriculture, whether it's fertilizers, those derivatives. But then in some areas where there's heavy industry like cement and steel, I think the role of gas in making sure that there is the continued access to the classic definition of reliable, secure, and affordable supplies in those industries, and particularly thinking of Nuevo Leon. So that's where I would leave it.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, so I think you Jeremy and Jennifer touched on the major industries, but what is needed to power those industries is the electric power segment. CFE has really gone all in on natural gas fired power plants and combined cycle. 60% of the energy matrix is now based on natural gas fired power plants. CFE is developing a couple more gigawatts of natural gas fire. CFE is one of the major North American natural gas marketers with its subsidiary CFE International in the United States, and it's made it very clear that it wants to increase demand for natural gas to basically fill up a lot of the capacity it has on pipelines in Mexico. And so the electrical power segment, I think, will continue being a major driver of natural gas demand.
Thanks very much, Chris. Before we move into our Q&A part of today's event, I want to remind viewers, if you've got questions that have come to your mind as you've been watching our event thus far, you can either put them in the Q&A box here on the Zoom, or you can click on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. I want to ask you all a question about the elections that are coming up. We've got elections on both sides of the border in 2024. It's something that happens once every 12 years, given Mexico's sexenio and the US presidential mandate lasting 4 years. We have an alignment every 12 years, and we have that in 2024. We at CSIS Americas anticipate that energy will be part of that overall campaign, the discussion. In Mexico, in the Mexican context, how do you all think energy is going to be discussed in the 2024 presidential campaign? What should the candidates be thinking about and talking about as they gear up for the election cycle? And Chris, I might start with you and then go in reverse order this time.
Yeah, so obviously a huge issue. I think in the previous presidential cycle, energy emerged as one of the most important issues, and I think it remains to this day extremely important. Obviously, the energy transition has sort of not been talked about during the sexenio, and I think it's something that needs to be talked about. Claudia Sheinbaum has brought up this idea. But I think natural gas, again, is extraordinarily important. Mexico needs to focus on not only on its relationship with the United States, but on developing its own resources. I spoke to CNH Commissioner Héctor Moreira recently, and he seems to think that the oil and gas rounds that were suspended by AMLO need to be reinstituted. And so I think that's going to be part of the discussion as well. Some of the major changes that happened, which ones worked, which ones didn't, and how can Mexico improve its natural gas production domestically.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jeremy?
Well, I always like to say energy is political and policy is politics. That's sort of my catchphrase. I probably repeat too often, but there it is. And so, yeah, no, there's an absolute intersection, as we saw. And the next part of that catchphrase is really, how do you implement campaign rhetoric into policies, right? And I think that's what we've seen with the López Obrador administration. So the question now will be, what kind of campaign rhetoric? We still need to get the candidates for the various parties or groupings set. And then once we start to hear the campaign rhetoric, to start thinking about how can that campaign rhetoric be translated into actual policy developments. It was not, some of the really, really strong campaign rhetoric of the López Obrador, the race he ran, and, very successful race he ran, didn't ultimately get translated, right? The famous Easter Day defeat of the major power sector overhaul constitutional reform didn't happen. So point being that a lot can be said in the campaign, and it does not always translate to policy developments. The final comment is that there will have to be some kind of pragmatic, I think, approach to energy, whether it's restarting bid rounds, whether it's restarting the auction process, whether it's taking a deeper look at why CFE continues to burn so much fuel oil when it should be, whether it's turning to more gas or whether it's deploying more renewables. The one thing I've always thought that was crazy is this war on renewables that people call the current administration of Mexico launching or using. There's no reason CFE couldn't be one of the most important developers of renewable energy. There's nothing that would, constrain them, and it would allow for the primacy of the state enterprise to be the deployer of major renewables. Now, we do see a little bit of that with Sonora and the Sonora plan. But again, my earlier comment, is it too late? Is it enough? And so I think what you're going to have to see is a bit of catch up. Again, the next administration, and therefore whoever is taking over and residing in Los Pinos, is going to have to be more pragmatic and really probably return to some of the market-based elements that this government tried to, if not slow down, overhaul and overturn.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Jennifer?
So I think you're going to see from whoever the candidate is a couple of things. Availability. Availability is going to be really important. Do we have the energy we need to sustain the growth, to attract nearshoring? Affordability. You got to be able to afford it because Mexico has to be competitive, right? And I think sustainability. I think the next administration is going to care a lot about the sustainability elements and carry that through. So I think those are three principles that I think you're going to see regardless of the candidate. I think you're going to see a sustainment of bringing energy to the Southeast. We have to bring the Southeast forward. And I think the next administration will carry that through, and it'll continue to be a priority. I also think you're going to have to see investment stability. We talked about the pragmatism. I don't think Mexico's hacienda has to finance everything. I think this administration, at least in the last 12, 18 months, is demonstrating an ability to partner, to find strategic partners, to find people that see a value in that relationship. And that will enable the government to have a piece of the action, a piece of the equity. Nationalism is very important, but then have private industry that can leverage their balance sheet and international financing to come and make those investments, because I do not think hacienda can sustain and backstop everything. It's not practical, it's not pragmatic, and it's not competitive. So I think the next administration will perhaps carry that through to look at some more strategic partnerships so that you can have a win-win. And so I think those are some things that you might see in the next administration.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I want to bring up one more question before we move to our Q&A portion, and I'm glad to see that we've got some questions populating in the Q&A here on Zoom. It's been mentioned throughout our conversation how gas plays a role as not just a bridge, but also in some of the renewables that Mexico could become competitive in. And I want to ask a question particularly about natural gas as an important feedstock for certain forms of hydrogen, particularly blue hydrogen, which is something we've done a little bit of work on at CSIS Americas. What do you all assess the potential is for hydrogen in Mexico? How does the gas industry in Mexico think about hydrogen as a next stage potentially in the energy transition? And Chris, I'll start with you again and go in the same order as last time.
I think it's still very, very early days for hydrogen. We have seen some advances in RNG and in biogas. I think the hope is that a lot of the infrastructure that has been built, and it's quite significant and it continues to be built, can be used for potential hydrogen, blue hydrogen or whatever color hydrogen down the road. I do think it potentially could be very hard to compete with countries like the United States, where you have, the IRA that make it, highly attractive to develop north of the border of the United States. And so in that sense, it will be difficult for Mexico. But it's very early days. But of course, I think everyone's looking very closely at hydrogen.
Thank you, Chris. Jeremy?
Not to be really negative here, but it will allow me to be very concise. Mexico has no near-term opportunity for hydrogen beyond whatever industrial uses may be happening with Pemex. Sorry, I see everything that Chris says about the competitiveness that will be only enhanced in the coming years in the U.S. because of the IRA. I don't see a near-term reason for Mexico to dabble in hydrogen.
Jennifer, do you see the same as Jeremy and Chris?
Yeah, I agree. I don't see the near-term reason either. I do see that longer term, they'll have the infrastructure. Mexico can be a fast follower. They don't have to pilot. They don't have to do demonstration here. I think let's build out the grid. Let's electrify where we don't have electrification. Let's decarbonize. And then let's use our money very wisely and then leapfrog when the technology advancements have been proven out and there's an economic and a fundamental reason to advance beyond that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. I want to move into our Q&A portion now so that we have enough time to address some of the questions that are coming in. Again, if you've got a question, you can put it into the Q&A box in Zoom, or you can click on the event webpage where it says Ask Live Questions and input your question there. The first question I'll pose rather to the entire panel, and it is from Sonal. It's, will Mexico go ahead and ship gas to Southeast Asian markets? What about fuel diversification into renewables? Well, we discussed a little bit just now about hydrogen, but feel free to address other renewables as well. And Jennifer, I might start with you and go in the other order.
Yes, so I do think you'll see Mexico ship LNG to Asia. There's a competitive advantage for them to do that. And I do see that there will be more advancement of renewable energy. We're already seeing deal flow pick up right now. So I do think that you'll see where's the need, where there's the opportunity, where there is the transmission stability. This is really important. I think that one of the reasons perhaps we saw a bit of slowdown was also grid stability. You need to be able to interconnect and you need to be able to have voltage support to push electricity around the grid. And I think those are one of those, that's an element that the CFE certainly was considering. But I think we will see, as the reliability of the existing system improves, with the gas generation that's being built and expected to come online in the next 2 to 3 years, I think we'll be able to see more renewables enter the market because they'll have the backup supply to do that.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Jeremy?
Yes, Mexico will absolutely land LNG, not perhaps its own domestically developed molecules, but it will, via its infrastructure on the Pacific, land LNG in the Asian markets. I'm not going to bet on which project will be first, but it's going to happen for sure. The question, and I think coming back to some of what we just talked about, and Jennifer made a great point, the countries that I would suggest are going to be movers on particularly green hydrogen are those that have a decarbonized or a almost decarbonized power sector and have the ability to harness their renewable capacity to move into the hydrogen space, which is important to understand why I commented earlier why I didn't think Mexico will or can in the near term. But what that also speaks to is Mexico's need, and Jennifer also spoke to this about the next government, Mexico's need to approach its energy sector, and particularly its electric system, in a way that is able to bring more renewables to marry with the gas, that base load, and to really bring more renewables into the mix, right? Whether it's CFE, whether it's partnerships, whether it's tenders, whether it's the auction process, once again, there's no reason, particularly in northern Mexico, but most of the country, whether you're talking wind or solar, but the north with solar opportunities, there's no reason Mexico shouldn't be one of the world's leading renewable developers and deployers of renewable energy in its matrix. Yes, the reliability of the grid and the need to enhance infrastructure. Well, guess what? That brings me back to the point of tender partnerships that were tender partnerships for transmission expansion, tender partnerships for grid reliability projects. Those are, to me, obvious on the table for the next government to consider.
Yeah, let me just speak quickly to the LNG part. In June, 50% of all U.S. LNG shipments had to go around the Cape of Good Horn because of congestion in the Panama Canal and low water levels. And that really gives a huge advantage to these West Coast projects in Mexico. Not to mention they're going to get Waha gas, which is the most affordable gas on earth almost. And so Energía Costa Azul is coming online early next year. You have MPL with a lot of Mexico Pacific Limited with a lot of commercial momentum, and so we do see some of these LNG projects certainly going ahead. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Chris. I have 2 questions in the question and answer box specifically for you, Jennifer. They're directed at you. And these are from Andrew Baker. The first is, when Southeast Gateway enters service, how will it impact the utilization rate of the Merino pipeline? Will the Merino system need to be expanded? That's question one. And number two is, does TC Energy plan to participate in LNG exports from Mexico's Pacific coast? So you've got a bunch of stuff to address there.
Sure. Well, for the first question, at this juncture, relative to the capacity on Sur de Texas, which brings gas from Texas in through Tuxpan, we're not anticipating that we'll need to expand Sur de Texas at this time. But as we see the Transísmico corridor developed, as we see perhaps LNG exports out of Coatzacoalcos, as we see the Mayacan come online and demand growth into the Yucatan Peninsula, there is the ability to expand it to a degree. That will be up to CFE. I mean, we talked about CFE being the predominant holder of capacity. They're the underwriter of all this capacity, so that's why they're the predominant holder of the capacity. And again, it's very interesting. I think that we keep talking about Pemex's role, and Pemex is a very, very important role in domestic resource production. But I would say, looking toward the future, CFE has a really significant role in the electrification of the country and the movement of gas. They really underpinned the infrastructure being developed, or that has been developed, in natural gas. And so I think that you could see the expandability of Sur de Texas in the future, but it's not right now and are not required to bring Puerto Celeste online by 2025. The second question was, will TC Energy participate in LNG export? We will certainly ship as much gas to LNG exporters as they want. We look at the Pacific opportunities. We see tidewater off of the Manzanillo Bay, where we have the Manzanillo-Guadalajara pipeline, which also connects into the Esencia system, which brings gas right from the Permian. Of course, we've talked about New Fortress Energy will be shipping gas to Central America and potentially Europe this fall. They've interconnected into Sur de Texas. So as I think we're one of the largest connectors into LNG exports in the United States. And of course, we're completing our Coastal GasLink pipeline, which will ship gas to LNG Canada. So again, as a major infrastructure player, we are moving a lot of gas for export, and we'll continue to facilitate that in Mexico.
Thank you very much indeed, Jennifer, for that very detailed answer. There's a great question that's come in from the live webinar, and it's about Mexico's storage capacity for LNG. And this is something that we didn't get to discuss, but I think it's worth us discussing this. The question is, one of Mexico's biggest challenges seems to be its lack of storage for LNG. Mexico has just over a 2-day storage capacity, whereas countries like Spain and Germany have upwards of 30 days. How can Mexico improve its storage infrastructure? And Chris, I might start with you, and then Jeremy, then Jennifer.
Yeah, so Mexico had an energy storage plan in place with the previous administration, and unfortunately, nothing has really happened on that front. And we saw some of the impacts, the potential impacts of not having storage during Winter Storm Uri, when natural gas supplies were squeezed in Mexico in 2021. There has been momentum recently to tender the JAF field and the Brazil field, which would provide, I forget the figures, but a couple more days of natural gas. I mean, the Brazil field is absolutely massive. But we've heard about the tender, but we haven't seen concrete steps toward it. But that would obviously be something that would be very beneficial to energy security in the Mexico market.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jeremy?
I know that IMCO did a great study looking at just this exact topic. So I would just direct people to that, and if you want to get a little deeper dive into that question, and then I'll allow experts like Jennifer, who actually build infrastructure and can actually speak to this a lot more than somebody who focuses on geopolitics and the intersection of policy in energy. So I'll let Jennifer really answer this one.
Thanks, Jeremy. And for those who don't know the acronym INCO, it's the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness. Jennifer?
So I think storage is going to become a more important component of supply diversity in Mexico. I think you're going to want to have advantage for that. not just because of LNG, but because you're going to have a bunch of natural gas fired power plants. Utilization across everybody's pipeline system is increasing because demand is growing in the country, and it will be harder to line pack, right? Because you're going to have the pull. So I would expect in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see a more purposeful call for storage, backstopping perhaps of storage from large market participants, maybe CFE, maybe LNG providers. And so I think you'll see that Senegas has talked about it for quite some time. I think it's just a natural, I mean, CFE is and obviously I talk about them because they're my client, but I think they're the 8th or 9th largest utility in the world. It's just part of prudent management. When you're long gas and your pipelines are full, you're going to need something else there to manage your optionality, to manage your reliability. And I think, again, it's just the evolution of this market. It's the maturity of the market, and you're going to see it. And it's not evolving particularly differently than other North American markets. And so I think you're going to see this. There's storage that's underutilized today. And so again, I think in the future, as pipelines become with higher capacity factors and utilization, you're going to need something to give you that optionality and reliability.
Thank you. Ryan, could I jump in? I just want to ask Jennifer, because what I always am curious about is the U.S., there's so much, when we talk storage, underground storage, right? Because obviously what you focused on was the infrastructure side of how much infrastructure storage does that give you? What do you know about, and I'm Chris, you as well, sorry to jump in, but I'm curious about Mexico's underground and that kind of, those kinds of storage options.
Yeah, so Chris probably has a map, but there are reservoirs and there's options across the country in different locations where you can have underground storage. And so the technology is quite advanced relative to your injection and your withdrawal rates. You just need a backstop and a contract. So I think the infrastructure, or excuse me, the reservoir base is here that you could do that. I think you just need the commercial construct in order to advance that. And you need that when someone believes it's important enough to have it. Chris?
Yeah, I agree. As I mentioned, the Energy Ministry and Senegas during the previous administration did all sort of the legwork, and the fields have been identified that can be used for underground storage. It's a matter of investment at this stage.
Fantastic. That's a great point to add on to the question. No, thank you. Thanks very much, Jeremy. So there's one more really, really good question, if I can stretch our time for just a few more minutes, our time together for just a few more minutes. And it's about people. We've been discussing throughout the hour about how natural gas affects Mexico's development, its economic trajectory, and we've kept focus on people and make sure people have better lives. But there's a question that we had come in about people who feel strongly in the other direction, and we've seen protests and mobilizations against pipelines in particular in the U.S. and in Canada. Has there been a similar outcry in Mexico? Part one of the question. Part two of the question: how can natural gas companies manage this in their planning and deployment of critical pipeline infrastructure? And Jeremy, I might start with you on this one, because it's about risk. It's about risk, and it's about political risk and pipelines. I'll start with you, and then I'll give the others a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, well, no, there absolutely have been issues. There's one major pipeline in particular where there have been certain communities that have protested and basically tried to challenge that development or final implementation. So absolutely. I mean, there is the famous social license to operate. We haven't yet, after an hour, put that on the table, but there is the question of how can, whether it's a government, whether it's a company, whomever who's developing major infrastructure, gain the input and the social license from the communities where they will pass or where their infrastructure will be built and developed to be able to move forward with those kinds of projects. And that is increasingly complicated, right? Because there are oftentimes complete asymmetry and there's not alignment as to what one community may wish have it in terms of what its desires that need to be addressed compared to other communities. In certain areas of Mexico, you have questions around water. In certain areas of Mexico, you have questions around ejidos. You can go on and on, but the point is, it is a very complex. And the only thing I would add is, it means that companies and the government too are all in this together when you seek to build the kinds of hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of pipeline or the kinds of LNG infrastructure that we're talking about here, right? So this needs to be a concerted effort of not just the industry, but government as well, and communities and everyone, trying to find what is the right balance and to really trying to find the point of equilibrium so that there can be those economic opportunities delivered, but at the same time that the communities have the ability to give input and not just have projects or developments forced down their proverbial throats, right?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That's great. Chris, would you like to weigh in? And then I'll let Jennifer have the last word.
Yeah, no, just very, very briefly, I think the solution to a lot of the protests against pipeline development has been what Jennifer has mentioned, these public-private partnerships where the government has really helped out and has worked together with the private sector companies and the communities and sort of trying to highlight the potential benefits. I think in terms of Mexico, more so in the United States, it's about affordable energy and energy security. And I would make the argument that developing natural gas pipelines, and really the natural gas industry is really a history of pipeline development. It's very, getting natural gas to market is far more complex than in the case of oil. I would make the argument that it's easier in Mexico to develop natural gas infrastructure these days than it is in the United States.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jennifer, the last word, over to you.
Yeah, I would echo what Jeremy and Christopher said. It isn't easy to develop infrastructure anywhere, to be frank. It's hard. And, when we made the decision to put more money into Mexico, a significant amount of money, what we had to have confidence is not just about fundamentals. We had to have confidence that the president of the country, that Mexico really wanted this, right? And that we had a commercial arrangement such that there was adequate risk sharing. Now, how does that relate to communities? Because of the private partnership, there is an alignment with what's in the interest of Mexico to develop this infrastructure. This is critical. All these pipelines, not just our pipeline, but the Mayacan pipeline, the pipelines that are being developed are first generation pipelines. They're in the national interest. And, our obligation is to create trust and to be open and transparent and try to build that bridge with a community, to honor our commitments that we make to a community, because the benefits to a community are not just in the purchase of land, but it's in the social investment that comes with that. It's with the job creation. I mentioned before, we're building Puerto Celeste. 4,000 direct jobs. I've been out to the communities. I've talked to the people working on our pipelines, and for them, this meant they didn't have to leave their family. They could live in Tuxpan and have a good job, right? That matters to people. And so these are the things that we need to continue to do a better job talking about, continue to honor those commitments. And to be very frank, when it's challenging to build pipelines in a community, it's usually not the community member that's challenging you. It's somebody from outside the community that doesn't have necessarily the interest of the nation or the interest in that community, but some other bias that creates the challenge and makes it really hard. But we're committed to learning from every project. And we think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity to do a lot of social good here by investing in natural gas infrastructure in Mexico. So we hope we get to continue to do that and working with CFE to realize those ambitions.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'm conscious of the fact that we're over time, so thanks for sticking with us. This has been a fascinating discussion. It's been a very wide-ranging discussion, and as Jeremy mentioned about our notional questions in the concept memo that we sent over, there are any number of areas that we can discuss, and so it's safe to say that CSIS Americas is going to continue its research efforts in this space. But for now, we have to leave it here. Thank you so much, Jennifer Pierce, President of TC Energy, Jeremy M. Martin, Vice President of Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas, and Christopher Lenton, the Senior Editor for Mexico and Latin America at Natural Gas Intelligence. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.